Airport staff mock a black woman's disability. Moments later, the airline CEO steps in and fires them. At an ordinary airport terminal, a seemingly routine check-in quickly spirals into an unforgettable story of humiliation, power, and ultimate redemption. A black woman in a wheelchair, carrying herself with quiet dignity, becomes the target of cruel mockery by airline staff. But what happens next shocks everyone involved and sends a powerful message about respect and justice. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of holiday travelers. Families hurriedly hauling overstuffed luggage, business people balancing laptops and coffee, and airport announcements cutting through the air like clockwork. Clara Baker sat quietly in her wheelchair, observing it all with a calm resilience that had become second nature over the years. Despite her composed exterior, her heart beat slightly faster as she neared the airline's check-in counter. She adjusted her scarf, a deep emerald green that complemented her sharp, tailored coat. Clara liked to present herself with dignity, refusing to let her wheelchair define how the world saw her. But as she approached the counter, the staff's initial reactions made her skin prickle. "Hi, welcome to Sky View Airlines," chirped Brenda, a blonde woman in her late 20s whose overly saccharine tone was unmistakably condescending. Her eyes flickered to the wheelchair before quickly returning to Clara's face. Her smile faltered for a split second, just long enough for Clara to notice. Next to Brenda, Mark, a tall man with a perpetual smirk, leaned slightly toward his coworker, as if sharing a private joke. "I need to check in," Clara said evenly, sliding her ID and ticket across the counter. Brenda's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, as if the simple task of typing Clara's information had suddenly become complicated. "Oh, are you sure you're at the right counter?" she asked, her voice lilting in fake politeness. "This is for first class." Clara raised an eyebrow, her calm exterior hiding a flicker of irritation. "I'm in the right place," she replied firmly. "Seat 2A. Brenda's eyes widened slightly before she plastered on another insincere smile. "Oh, my mistake," she said, her voice dripping with mock cheer. "We just don't see." "Well, never mind." Mark snorted softly, quickly covering his mouth with his hand. The sound didn't escape Clara's notice, nor did the quick glance he exchanged with Brenda. Clara kept her composure, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Brenda continued typing, though her hands moved slower than necessary. As she prepared Clara's boarding pass, she glanced at the wheelchair and asked loudly, "So, will you need someone to help you not get lost? Airports can be tricky for people like you." A wave of heat crept up Clara's neck, but she maintained her poised demeanor. "I think I'll manage just fine, thank you," she said, her tone as sharp as the glare she leveled at Brenda. Brenda gave an exaggerated shrug. "All right, if you say so." As she handed over the boarding pass, it slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. Brenda covered her mouth in mock dismay. "Oh no, so clumsy of me." Mark let out a short laugh, the kind meant to needle. "Better practice those reflexes," he said under his breath, just loud enough for Clara to hear. Clara bent down, her movements deliberate and steady, picking up the pass with a grace that belied her frustration. She straightened in her chair, locking eyes with Brenda. "Everyone deserves respect," she said softly but firmly. Her words hung in the air like a quiet challenge. Brenda's smile wavered, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, have a great flight," she chirped, her tone hollow. Clara didn't respond. She turned and wheeled herself toward the security checkpoint, her back straight and head high. But as she moved away, she heard Brenda's whispered comment, "You'd think she'd be used to it by now." Mark chuckled. "Guess some people just like being difficult." The words stung, not because they were new. Clara had heard worse, but because they still carried the same bitter sting of casual cruelty. She clenched her jaw and kept moving, her mind repeating the same mantra she always used in moments like this. Don't stoop to their level, rise above it. As she neared the security line, Clara took a deep breath, preparing herself for what she knew would likely be another ordeal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this day was about to take a turn she hadn't anticipated. The security line snaked through the terminal like a restless serpent, with travelers shifting impatiently as they waited for their turn. Clara joined the queue, her wheelchair gliding steadily over the polished floor. The faint hum of conveyor belts and the occasional beep from the scanners blended into the background noise. But Clara's focus remained sharp. She had navigated countless airports before and knew how these moments could easily turn into an ordeal. Ahead of her, a family struggled to remove shoes, belts, and jackets while wrangling two toddlers. Behind her, a man loudly complained about the inefficiency of the process. Clara remained calm, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her chair, her demeanor unflinching. She was used to being scrutinized, whether out of curiosity or judgment, but she refused to let it show. As she neared the front of the line, she noticed Brenda and Mark hovering near the security area. Brenda was chatting animatedly with one of the TSA agents, her exaggerated gestures drawing attention. Clara's stomach tightened slightly. She hadn't expected them to still be around, and their lingering presence felt intentional. Next, called a TSA officer, waving Clara forward. She wheeled herself to the counter, handing over her ID and boarding pass. The officer, a stocky man with tired eyes, gave her a brief glance before nodding. "You're clear. Just head through the scanner, and we'll check your chair separately." Clara gave a small nod and began moving toward the scanner when Brenda's voice rang out, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Wait a second," Brenda called, striding over with Mark trailing behind her. "I think you should double-check her wheelchair. You never know what people might be hiding." The TSA officer frowned, glancing between Brenda and Clara. "Ma'am, we follow standard protocol for all passengers." Brenda interrupted, her voice gaining a sharp edge. "I'm just saying, you don't want to be responsible if something gets through. Better safe than sorry, right?" Clara's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. She turned to Brenda, her voice calm but steely. "Is there a problem?" Brenda smiled thinly, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Oh no, no problem. I just want to make sure everyone's safe. I'm sure you understand." Mark smirked, crossing his arms. "Yeah, got to follow the rules, right?" The TSA officer sighed, clearly reluctant but unwilling to argue. "All right, ma'am, we'll conduct a secondary inspection." Clara clenched her jaw but nodded. "Of course." She maneuvered herself to the side as instructed, lifting herself slightly so the TSA agents could inspect her chair. Their hands moved methodically, patting down the leather cushions and checking the compartments. Sarah felt the weight of Brenda and Mark's gazes, their smug satisfaction palpable. She heard a few murmurs from other passengers, but no one stepped forward to question the situation. The inspection dragged on longer than necessary, with the TSA agent pausing every so often to check with his supervisor. Clara's patience remained intact, though she could feel the heat of frustration building in her chest. She knew this wasn't about security. It was about control, about humiliation. But she refused to let them see her falter. Finally, the TSA agent stepped back, clearing his throat. "You're all set, ma'am. Sorry for the inconvenience." Clara nodded, her tone measured. "Thank you." Brenda's voice chimed in again as Clara began to wheel herself toward the gate. "Better safe than sorry, right?" she said with a laugh, her words carrying just enough volume to ensure they were heard. Clara stopped. She turned her chair slightly, locking eyes with Brenda. Her gaze was piercing, her voice calm but cutting. "You should remember something," she said, her words deliberate. "People notice more than you think, and some actions have consequences." For a fleeting moment, Brenda's confident smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes. "Whatever you say," she muttered, turning back to Mark with a dismissive laugh. Clara didn't linger. She straightened her back and wheeled herself toward her gate, her resolve unwavering. The faint sting of humiliation burned in her chest, but it was quickly overtaken by a quiet sense of certainty. Brenda and Mark might think they'd had the last word, but Clara knew better. The universe, she'd learned, had a way of balancing the scales, and sometimes, it didn't take long for karma to arrive. Clara's wheels rolled steadily along the corridor, the soft hum of her motorized chair barely audible over the cacophony of airport noise. She kept her head high, her eyes fixed ahead, but the words from Brenda and Mark replayed in her mind like a taunting echo. She didn't need anyone's pity, but the casual cruelty of their behavior was harder to brush off. The gate was just up ahead, the digital screen above it announcing her flight to New York. She allowed herself a small breath of relief. Soon she would be in the air, leaving this unpleasant experience behind. Yet, as she approached the waiting area, something caught her eye. A man sitting quietly off to the side, his gaze following her. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his polished leather shoes reflecting the airport's fluorescent lights. Despite his unassuming posture, there was an air of authority about him. His sharp features betrayed little emotion, but his piercing gray eyes seemed to be studying everything, taking in the scene with quiet intensity. Clara briefly locked eyes with him before turning her attention back to the gate. She wasn't in the mood for more scrutiny, even from a stranger. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. As she settled into a spot near the gate, she glanced around the room. Passengers filled the rows of seats, scrolling through their phones or chatting in low tones. Brenda and Mark were there too, hovering near the gate desk. Their body language was relaxed and smug. Brenda leaned on the counter, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to another staff member, while Mark laughed at something on his phone. Clara ignored them and turned her attention to her own phone, scrolling aimlessly in an attempt to distract herself. But her focus kept drifting, her thoughts circling back to the encounter at security. The humiliation she endured wasn't new. It was just another chapter in a long history of navigating a world that often refused to see her beyond her wheelchair. Still, it didn't make it any easier. Her fingers hovered over her screen as she considered sending a message to her assistant, detailing the incident, but something held her back. She wanted to handle this on her own terms, without escalating it unnecessarily. After all, what could really be done? Across the room, the man in the suit stood, his movement catching her attention. He adjusted his jacket and began walking slowly toward the gate desk, his steps measured and deliberate. Clara watched him out of the corner of her eye. Curiosity piqued despite herself. He approached Brenda and Mark, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Brenda straightened slightly, her casual demeanor replaced with a hint of nervousness. Mark pocketed his phone, his smirk fading as he glanced at the man. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and steady. "Are you Brenda Jenkins and Mark Porter?" Brenda blinked, caught off guard. Yes," she said hesitantly. "That's us. Can I help you?" The man's expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle edge to his tone as he spoke. "I couldn't help but notice your interaction with one of our passengers earlier, the woman in the wheelchair." Mark's face flushed slightly. We were just following procedure," he said quickly. "Making sure everything was in order, you know?" Brenda forced a smile, her voice taking on its usual saccharine tone. "Yes, we always prioritize safety and security. Is there a problem?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly toward Clara, who was watching the exchange with growing interest. Then, he turned back to Brenda and Mark, his gaze sharp. "Actually, there is," he said, his tone hardening. "You see, I'm Frank Wilson, the CEO of this airline, and I take incidents like this very seriously." The color drained from Brenda's face. Mark's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For a moment, the two staff members stood frozen, their earlier smugness evaporating under the weight of Frank's words. Frank didn't wait for a response. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable. Mocking and humiliating a passenger, especially one with a disability, is not something this airline tolerates." The quiet intensity of his voice cut through the room, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Whispers spread like wildfire as people began to piece together what was happening. Brenda finally found her voice. "Mr. Wilson, I didn't mean any harm. It was just a misunderstanding." Frank held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm not interested in excuses. Your actions reflect poorly on this airline, and they've undermined the values we stand for. Consider this your last day of employment." The weight of his words hung in the air like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. Brenda's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious. Please, I need this job." Frank's expression didn't waver. "Then perhaps you should have considered that before you treated a valued passenger with such disrespect." Mark tried to step in. "Mr. Wilson, if I could just..." Frank turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "You're equally at fault. Both of you are dismissed, effective immediately." Clara watched the scene unfold, a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief washing over her. She hadn't expected justice to arrive so swiftly or so publicly. For the first time all day, she allowed herself a small smile, her faith in karma momentarily restored. Frank turned back toward Clara, his expression softening as he approached her. "Miss Baker," he said warmly, "I deeply apologize for what you've experienced today. It's unacceptable, and I assure you, steps will be taken to prevent it from happening again." Clara met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I appreciate your actions. It means a lot." He nodded. "Your advocacy and contributions to this airline have been invaluable. I regret that anyone under our employment would treat you with anything less than the utmost respect." As he spoke, the murmurs around the gate grew louder, passengers piecing together Clara's importance. But Clara didn't dwell on it. Instead, she straightened in her chair, her confidence returning in full force. "Sometimes, it takes moments like these to make real change," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. Frank smiled, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Indeed, it does." The terminal began to quiet as passengers returned to their seats, some stealing glances at Clara, others murmuring softly among themselves. Brenda and Mark had disappeared, escorted out by another staff member under Frank Wilson's orders. Their departure was marked by the faint sound of Brenda's protests, fading into the background. Yet even with the air beginning to settle, Clara couldn't shake the tension in her chest. Frank Wilson stood beside her now, his presence a calm, yet commanding force. He gestured toward a more private seating area by the window, away from prying eyes. "Would you mind if we spoke for a moment, Miss Baker?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated, scanning his face for any sign of pretense. There was none. His expression carried sincerity, tinged with a subtle regret she suspected came not just from this incident, but from the broader implications of what had transpired. She nodded. Of course. Frank guided her to a seat near a row of tall glass windows overlooking the tarmac outside. Planes taxied against the backdrop of a dimming sky, streaked with shades of orange and purple. The world beyond the glass felt a stark contrast to the storm Clara still felt brewing inside her. As she positioned her wheelchair comfortably, Frank took the seat across from her, leaning slightly forward with his hands clasped. His polished demeanor remained intact, but up close, Clara noticed the slight furrow in his brow, a sign of genuine concern. "I owe you more than an apology, Miss Baker," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "What happened today is a failure on multiple levels, not just on the part of those two employees, but also on the systems that allowed them to behave that way unchecked." Clara listened silently, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't sure what she had expected him to say, but his words carried a weight that hinted at something deeper. He continued, "You've been a significant advocate for accessibility and inclusivity in the airline industry. I've seen firsthand how much thought and care you've put into making air travel more equitable for everyone. And to think that even with all you've done, you were subjected to this kind of treatment. It's unacceptable." There was a pause, the kind that invited a response. Clara folded her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing the hem of her coat as she considered her words. "I've faced this kind of behavior more times than I can count," she said finally, her voice calm but tinged with weariness. "It's exhausting, Mr. Wilson, to constantly feel like I have to prove my worth, just to be treated with basic respect." Frank's jaw tightened slightly, and he gave a slow nod. "I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And I won't pretend that an apology from me can erase the harm that's been done. It's not just about me," Clara said, her voice firm. "It's about the countless others who don't have the platform or the voice to push back. For every incident like this that gets addressed, how many more go unnoticed?" Frank leaned back slightly, his hands unclasping as he let her words sink in. "You're right," he said after a moment. "It's not enough to just address what happened today. This has to be a wake-up call for the entire company. No, for the entire industry." Clara studied him, noting the conviction in his tone. She could see that he wasn't just placating her. He was grappling with the magnitude of the issue. It was a start, but her experiences had taught her to temper her hope with caution. "What do you plan to do about it?" she asked, her voice steady but challenging. "Words are easy, Mr. Wilson. Action is what makes the difference." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered her question. "We'll start with mandatory inclusivity training for every employee from the top down," he said, his tone resolute. "And I'll personally ensure that the policies we have in place are enforced more strictly. But beyond that, I'd like your input, if you're willing. Your insight has always been invaluable, and I think it's time we elevated your role within the company." Clara raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden proposal. "Elevated how?" "I'd like you to lead a new initiative, an accessibility task force, dedicated to overhauling our practices and setting a new standard for the industry," he explained. "You'd have full autonomy, along with the resources you need to make meaningful changes." The weight of his words settled between them, and Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt all day: hope. But with it came a familiar hesitance, a quiet voice reminding her of the countless promises she'd heard before, only to see them fade into inaction. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but it'll take more than good intentions to make this work. Change requires commitment and accountability." Frank's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. "I understand, and I'm prepared to be held accountable, not just by you, but by everyone this initiative is meant to serve." For the first time since their conversation began, Clara allowed herself a small smile. "I'll consider it," she said, her voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "But I'll need to see that commitment in action before I fully agree." "Fair enough," Frank replied, with a slight smile of his own. He extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Clara took it. His handshake was firm but respectful, a gesture that felt genuine. As they sat there, the tension that had weighed so heavily on Clara began to lift, replaced by a sense of possibility. The journey ahead would be long, she knew, but for the first time that day, it felt like the scales were beginning to tip in the right direction. The minutes stretched quietly in the terminal. After her conversation with Frank Wilson, Clara found herself gazing out of the expansive windows overlooking the tarmac. The runway lights twinkled against the deepening twilight, casting long shadows across the sleek fuselages of parked planes. Somewhere out there, her own flight awaited, but her mind felt too restless to focus on the journey ahead. Clara's fingers toyed absent-mindedly with the scarf draped around her neck, the soft wool grounding her in the moment. The memory of Brenda and Mark's taunts still lingered, like a stubborn echo, refusing to fade. Despite Frank's swift and decisive actions, a nagging voice in the back of her mind asked, would they have faced consequences if I weren't who I am? The truth of it stung. Her advocacy work, her visibility in the airline industry, it all meant something. But what about those without her platform? Those who didn't have the CEO's ear? Her chest tightened at the thought of how many people had endured similar indignities, leaving them with no recourse but silent resignation. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to refocus. Dwelling on the broader injustices, though valid, wouldn't help her here and now. There was still more to consider, more to reflect upon. Clara glanced around the waiting area, her gaze settling on the other passengers who had witnessed the confrontation earlier. Most of them were back to their usual distractions: phones, tablets, idle conversations. A few avoided her gaze entirely, perhaps out of discomfort or guilt. But then there were others, like the older woman sitting 2 rows away, who looked at Clara with quiet admiration. The woman smiled warmly, nodding slightly when Clara's eyes met hers. It was a small gesture, but one that carried weight. Clara nodded back, appreciating the silent show of support, even if it had come too late to intervene earlier. A young couple sitting by the charging station whispered to each other, occasionally glancing in Clara's direction. The man's expression was thoughtful, while the woman seemed on the verge of approaching. Finally, she stood, smoothing her jacket before walking hesitantly over. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, her voice tinged with nervousness. I just wanted to say, I think you handled everything earlier with so much grace. I'm sorry for what you went through." Clara looked up, taken aback by the sincerity in the woman's tone. "Thank you," she replied, offering a faint smile. "It means a lot to hear that." The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing back at her partner before speaking again. "I wish we'd said something when it was happening. I wanted to, but I didn't know how to step in without making things worse." Clara regarded her thoughtfully, appreciating the honesty. "It's not always easy to know what to do in the moment," she said. "But the fact that you're reflecting on it now, that matters." The woman's face brightened slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. "Thank you," she said again before returning to her seat. As Clara watched her go, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had struggled with the same dilemma, wanting to help, but feeling paralyzed by uncertainty. The quiet moments of humanity, like this one, gave her hope that change was possible, even if it came slowly. The faint hum of an intercom, announcing a boarding call for another flight, broke Clara's reverie. She shifted slightly in her chair, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders from a long day of travel. Her thoughts drifted to Frank's offer, a task force for accessibility, full autonomy, resources at her disposal. It was an opportunity that could lead to real, tangible change. But with that opportunity came responsibility, and Clara knew better than anyone how heavy that weight could be. Advocacy wasn't just about fixing systems. It was about enduring the resistance, the dismissiveness, the uphill battles that came with challenging the status quo. She'd fought those battles before, and while the victories were rewarding, they were also exhausting. Could she take on even more? Would the task force truly have the power to create lasting change? Or would it become another corporate initiative, lost to bureaucracy and red tape? She had to weigh her options carefully, to ensure that her energy was spent in ways that would make the most impact. Her phone buzzed on the armrest, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, Janet. Janet, heard about the airport drama. Are you okay? Let me know if you need anything. Also, Frank Wilson called. He wants to set up a meeting with you when you land. Said it's urgent. Clara typed a quick reply, assuring Janet that she was fine and would follow up about the meeting once she reached New York. She appreciated Janet's efficiency, but even more so, her loyalty. The two had worked together for years, building a dynamic rooted in trust and mutual respect. As she set the phone down, Clara's gaze returned to the window. The golden hues of sunset had faded into a deep indigo, and the planes outside now glowed under the artificial light of the terminal. The sight was oddly comforting, a reminder of movement and progress, even in the face of stillness. "Attention passengers," came a voice over the intercom. "We are now beginning pre-boarding for Flight 257 to New York. Passengers needing additional assistance may board at this time." The announcement jolted Clara back to the present. She adjusted her scarf and reached for the controls on her chair. As she moved toward the gate, she noticed a new attendant at the desk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a warm smile. He greeted her with genuine courtesy, ensuring she had everything she needed before guiding her toward the jet bridge. "Safe travels, ma'am," he said as she passed, his tone earnest. Clara nodded in thanks, her heart feeling a little lighter. The earlier weight of the day hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted, making space for something else: resolve. She may not have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The jet bridge was unusually quiet, its narrow corridor humming faintly with the vibrations of machinery. Clara's hands rested lightly on the armrests of her wheelchair as she moved forward, her pace steady. Each glide of her chair echoed softly against the walls, amplifying the stillness around her. It gave her time to reflect, to let the events of the day settle into her mind, like the final pages of a heavy book being turned. Ahead, the door to the plane loomed, a threshold to another chapter of her journey. As she approached, a flight attendant stepped forward, her crisp uniform impeccable, her smile warm and professional. There was no trace of condescension in her demeanor, no hesitation in the way she met Clara's eyes. "Good evening, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice calm and measured. "My name is Elise. Welcome aboard. Let me assist you to your seat." Clara inclined her head slightly, her gaze searching Elise's expression for any hint of pity or insincerity. She found none. "Thank you," she replied, her voice polite but guarded. Elise moved with practiced ease, guiding Clara through the narrow aisle with a quiet confidence that eased some of Clara's apprehension. Passengers already seated glanced up briefly as she passed, some offering polite nods, others quickly returning to their screens or conversations. The faint murmur of voices and the rustle of carry-on bags filled the air, but it felt distant, like background noise in a theater. Clara's seat was near the front of the cabin, 2A, a first-class window seat that offered a rare combination of privacy and space. Elise paused beside it, stepping aside to give Clara room to maneuver. "Take your time," Elise said softly. "If you need anything during the flight, just let me know." Clara nodded, offering a faint smile. "I appreciate that." Once settled, Clara took a moment to adjust her scarf and smooth the fabric of her coat. The seat was spacious and comfortable, but the tension in her shoulders remained. She glanced out the window, the glow of the tarmac lights casting long shadows on the wings of the plane. Somewhere in the distance, a ground crewman directed a vehicle with precise hand signals, his orange vest fluorescent against the darkening sky. As the other passengers filed in, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of solitude. She leaned back in her seat, her hands resting in her lap, her mind drifting to Frank Wilson's offer. The idea of leading a task force carried a sense of purpose, a chance to transform the frustrations of her day into meaningful change. But it also carried the weight of expectations she wasn't sure she was ready to shoulder again. Her thoughts circled back to Brenda and Mark, their sneering faces a stark reminder of the battles she would continue to face. People like them weren't unique. They were emblematic of a larger culture, one that often dismissed or underestimated those who didn't fit neatly into preconceived molds. Could she really dismantle such deeply ingrained attitudes? And if she couldn't, what would it cost her to try? Her fingers tightened slightly on the armrest, the cool leather grounding her. For so long, she had prided herself on her resilience, her ability to rise above the ignorance of others. But resilience, she knew, came at a price, and today, she felt the weight of it more acutely than ever. Her musings were interrupted by the faint click of heels on the aisle floor. She glanced up to see a woman in her mid-40s, her dark hair swept into an elegant bun, her tailored pantsuit hinting at a corporate background. The woman paused near Clara's row, her eyes scanning the seat numbers before settling on 2B, the seat beside Clara. "Excuse me," the woman said politely, her voice smooth but businesslike. "This is my seat." Clara nodded and moved slightly to make room, watching as the woman placed her briefcase in the overhead compartment with practiced precision. She sat down with a sigh, smoothing her blazer before turning briefly to Clara. "Hi," the woman said, offering a courteous smile. "I'm Grace. Looks like we'll be seatmates for this flight." "Clara," she replied simply, returning the smile out of politeness. Grace seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if debating whether to continue the conversation. "It's a busy night, isn't it? I wasn't sure I'd make it through security in time." Those lines were a nightmare. Clara gave a non-committal nod, unsure of where the conversation was heading. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, but something in Grace's demeanor felt different, genuine perhaps. "You must travel a lot," Grace continued, glancing briefly at Clara's wheelchair before quickly looking away, as if afraid of appearing intrusive. "I mean, first-class regular, I'm guessing." Clara let out a quiet laugh, more out of surprise than amusement. "I do travel often, yes," she said. "For work, mostly." Grace smiled, sensing an opening. "Same here. I work in corporate training, lots of conferences and client meetings. Always on the move." Clara considered her for a moment before responding. "Corporate training," she repeated. "That must be interesting." "It has its moments," Grace said with a chuckle. "Mostly, it's about helping people unlearn bad habits. It's amazing how much resistance you get when you ask someone to reflect on their behavior." The words hung in the air, resonating with Clara more than she cared to admit. She gave a slight nod, her thoughts drifting back to Brenda and Mark. "I imagine that can be challenging," she said carefully. "It is," Grace agreed, "but it's worth it when you see even a small shift in perspective. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters." Clara studied her seatmate more closely, wondering if this was mere coincidence or some strange twist of fate. She decided to let the conversation rest, unsure whether she wanted to delve deeper into her own experiences just yet. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the muffled voice of the captain came over the intercom, announcing their route and expected flight time. Clara adjusted her seatbelt, her focus shifting to the rhythmic motion of the plane as it gained speed, the soft rumble of the engines growing louder. When the plane lifted off, Clara felt a familiar sense of detachment, as if the physical ascent mirrored the emotional distance she often sought during moments like these. Below, the city lights twinkled like scattered jewels, their brilliance muted by the haze of altitude. The world seemed smaller from up here, its troubles more distant, more manageable. But Clara knew that distance was temporary. The challenges she faced would still be there when the plane landed. The only question was how she would confront them. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of reprieve, the quiet hum of the cabin and the soft glow of the overhead lights lulling her into a rare sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own set of questions and decisions, but tonight, she could rest. The plane settled into its cruising altitude. The cabin darkened, except for the occasional glow of reading lights scattered among the passengers. Clara leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, the stars faint but persistent against the inky blackness. Far below, the city lights had faded, leaving only the vast, invisible expanse of the earth beneath them. The hum of the engines filled the silence, steady and unchanging, a comforting backdrop to the stillness of the cabin. Clara felt her body relax slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since the day began. Yet her mind remained restless, turning over the events of the past hours like pages in a book she couldn't close. She glanced at the tray table in front of her, where a small glass of water sat untouched. The condensation on the outside caught the faint glow of the overhead light, tiny droplets rolling down the surface like miniature rivers. Clara traced one with her eyes, letting its meandering path distract her, even briefly, from the weight of her thoughts. Beside her, Grace had opened her laptop, the soft glow of the screen illuminating her focused expression. She typed rapidly, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the ease of someone well-practiced. But after a few moments, Clara noticed Grace glance at her, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she spoke. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Grace said softly, tilting her laptop screen downward to lessen the light. "Sometimes I get so caught up in my work that I forget there's a person sitting next to me." Clara shook her head lightly, offering a polite smile. "You're fine. I've been enjoying the quiet." Grace returned the smile, then hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. "If it's not too forward to say," she began, her tone cautious, "you have a very calm presence. It's rare to meet someone who carries themselves the way you do." The comment caught Clara off guard. She turned to Grace, her expression unreadable. "I suppose I've learned how to stay composed," she said after a moment. "Life has a way of teaching you that." Grace nodded thoughtfully, her gaze steady but non-intrusive. "That's true. Composure often comes from experience, doesn't it? From navigating things most people don't see or understand." Clara studied her seatmate, sensing genuine curiosity rather than prying. Grace's words felt like an invitation, not a demand. And for a brief moment, Clara considered opening up. But the vulnerability that would require felt daunting, and she wasn't sure she was ready to share the weight of her day with a stranger. Instead, she turned the question back to Grace. "What about you? Your work must give you plenty of opportunities to see things from different perspectives." Grace's face softened, and she leaned back slightly in her seat. "It does," she admitted, "but it also reminds me how resistant people can be to change. Sometimes it feels like I'm constantly fighting uphill battles, trying to get people to unlearn biases they don't even realize they have." Clara tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "What motivates you to keep going?" Grace smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "I guess it's the small victories, the moments when someone finally gets it, when they see the world through a different lens. Those moments remind me that the effort is worth it." Clara nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of kinship with Grace's words. The parallels between their experiences weren't lost on her, though she wasn't sure how much she wanted to explore them just yet. The flight attendant, Elise, reappeared, moving quietly through the cabin as she checked on the passengers. When she reached Clara's row, she paused, her expression warm but professional. "Miss Baker," Elise said softly, "is there anything I can get for you? A blanket, perhaps, or something to drink?" Clara shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." Elise hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "If I may," she said gently, "I just wanted to say that it's an honor to have you aboard. Your work has been incredibly inspiring to many of us in the industry." Clara looked up, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "That means a lot to hear." Elise smiled and nodded before moving on, her presence leaving behind a faint ripple of reassurance. Clara watched her go, the flight attendant's words lingering in her mind. It wasn't the first time someone had acknowledged her work, but tonight, it felt particularly significant. It was a reminder that even on days like this, her efforts mattered. As the cabin grew quieter, with most passengers settling into the rhythm of the flight, Clara found herself turning inward again. The conversation with Frank Wilson replayed in her mind, his proposal a beacon of opportunity, but also a source of apprehension. The thought of leading a task force was both exciting and daunting, a chance to effect real change, but also a commitment that would demand much of her time, energy, and resilience. She thought about the younger version of herself, the woman who had first entered the world of advocacy with boundless optimism, believing that change was just a matter of effort and determination. Over the years, that optimism had been tempered by reality, by the slow pace of progress and the resistance she often faced. But it had never disappeared entirely. It was still there, quietly fueling her, even on the hardest days. Her gaze drifted back to the window. The stars seemed brighter now, their lights steady and unyielding. Clara allowed herself to focus on them, drawing a sense of calm from their constancy. They reminded her of something her mother used to say: even the smallest light can guide you through the darkest night. Grace had fallen silent beside her, her laptop now closed, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the beginning of the quiet hours of the flight. Clara closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines envelop her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was becoming clear. She couldn't let the events of today end with a single act of justice. Brenda and Mark's dismissal was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. If she wanted to create lasting change, she would need to channel her experiences and her frustrations into something greater. When the plane landed, she would call Frank Wilson. She would accept his offer, but on her terms. The task force wouldn't just be a corporate initiative. It would be a movement, a call to action that demanded accountability and systemic change. For now, though, she let herself rest, her resolve steadying, like the stars outside her window. The night was long, but morning would come, and with it, a new opportunity to light the way forward. The plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac, the faint bump of the landing gear grounding Clara in the present moment. Outside, the city of New York glimmered under the soft haze of morning light. The cabin hummed with the sounds of passengers gathering their belongings. Conversations murmured in low tones as people prepared to disembark. Clara, however, remained seated, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. The flight had given her clarity, a chance to reflect on the whirlwind of events and the decisions that awaited her. She adjusted her scarf, feeling the familiar texture against her skin, a quiet reminder of her resilience. Elise, the attentive flight attendant, appeared at her side, her expression warm and respectful. "Miss Baker, I hope you had a comfortable flight," she said softly. "The captain asked me to let you know that someone from the airline's executive team is waiting to meet you at the gate." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "Thank you, Elise. You've been wonderful." Elise smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "It was an honor to serve you, ma'am. And thank you for everything you do." As Clara exited the jet bridge, she was greeted by Frank Wilson himself. The CEO, still impeccably dressed, looked more relaxed now, though his demeanor retained its characteristic professionalism. Beside him stood another woman, slightly younger, holding an envelope in her hands. "Miss Baker," Frank began, his voice steady, "welcome to New York. I hope your flight was restful." Clara inclined her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It was peaceful, at least." Frank offered a small, knowing smile. "Good to hear. I wanted to personally thank you again for your patience and grace yesterday. The way you handled yourself in the face of such unacceptable behavior was inspiring, not just to me, but to many of our staff who've already heard about what happened." Clara regarded him carefully. She appreciated the sentiment, but words alone wouldn't erase the memory of Brenda and Mark's cruelty. "I'm glad to hear that," she said evenly. "But as we discussed, it's action that matters." Frank nodded, his expression serious. "And I'm committed to that action. But before we move forward, I wanted to do something to acknowledge what you endured." He gestured to the woman beside him, who stepped forward with the envelope. "This is a token of our gratitude," Frank explained. "As a formal apology from the airline, we're offering you an exclusive travel pass. Unlimited flights for a year, valid worldwide. First class, of course." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the gesture. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope as she considered what it represented. It wasn't just compensation for her experience. It was a recognition of her value and dignity as a passenger, something Brenda and Mark had so blatantly dismissed. "Unlimited flights," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Her lips curved into a small smile as she met Frank's gaze. "That's unexpected, but appreciated." Frank's expression lightened slightly. "It's the least we could do. And I hope it serves as a reminder that this airline values you, not just as a passenger, but as a partner in making air travel more inclusive." Clara accepted the envelope, the weight of it a tangible reminder of how far she had come. She glanced at Frank, sensing sincerity, and allowed herself to relax, just a little. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying both gratitude and resolve. "This is a generous gesture, but as you know, it's not the end of the story. I'll hold you to your promises, Mr. Wilson. The work we discussed, the task force, needs to be more than just words." Frank nodded firmly. "It will be. And I look forward to working with you to make it a reality." As they exchanged a final handshake, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past day had been challenging, but it had also been a reminder of her strength and the impact she could have when she refused to back down. As she exited the terminal, the cool New York air greeted her, carrying with it the promise of a new day. She glanced down at the envelope in her hands, a quiet smile spreading across her face. It wasn't just about the flights. It was about reclaiming her space in a world that so often tried to push her aside. With the city skyline rising before her, Clara felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the lightness of possibility. The horizon was open, and so was she. Outside the terminal, Clara waited for her car's service, her thoughts still lingering on the envelope in her lap. The bustling energy of New York pulsed around her, taxis honking, travelers rushing by with their bags in tow. Yet despite the chaos, she felt an unusual calm settling over her. The travel pass wasn't just a gift, it was an opportunity. Over the years, Clara's advocacy had taken her to countless airports and conferences, often on her own dime, her resolve outweighing the financial burden. Now, with a year of free travel, she could expand her reach, amplify her message, and push for real change in ways she had only dreamed of. But it wasn't just the past that gave her hope. Frank Wilson's promise of a task force felt more tangible now, more actionable. His apology had seemed genuine, but the real test would come in the months ahead. Whether the airline's culture could truly shift, whether Brenda and Mark's dismissal would be a warning to others. Clara had every intention of holding him accountable, not just for her own experience, but for the countless others who faced similar indignities every day. Her car pulled up to the curb, the driver stepping out to help her with her bags. As he placed them in the trunk, Clara settled into the back seat, her wheelchair carefully folded beside her. The hum of the city faded slightly as the car doors closed, leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. As the car turned onto the avenue, leading to her hotel, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Her journey hadn't been easy, marked by battles both personal and professional. She had faced countless obstacles, not just because of her disability, but because of the prejudices that came with it. Yet every challenge had strengthened her resolve, each small victory a reminder of why she continued to fight. The task force wasn't just about accessibility. It was about creating a world where dignity and respect weren't privileges, but rights, where people like her didn't have to endure humiliation just to move through the world. And while the work ahead would be difficult, Clara felt ready. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the hotel, the driver stepping out to assist her. As she rolled into the lobby, the vibrant energy of the city filled her with a sense of purpose. The past day had been a reminder of the worst in people, but also the best. The quiet kindness of strangers, the genuine remorse of a leader willing to make amends, the support of those who believed in her mission. In her room, Clara sat by the window, looking out at the sprawling city skyline. The sun had fully risen now, its golden light casting long shadows over the buildings. She opened the envelope once more, running her fingers over the travel pass inside. It was a symbol of recognition, of acknowledgement that her voice had been heard. But it was also a reminder of the work still to be done. She set the pass on the desk alongside her laptop and opened a fresh document. The cursor blinked at her, waiting. With a deep breath, she began typing. A plan, a vision for the task force she was about to lead. Every word carried the weight of her experiences, her hopes, her determination to create a better future. For Clara, the journey was far from over. But as she stared out at the horizon, she realized something important. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was open to her. No limits, no barriers, just possibilities. And she was ready to soar. And so, Clara's story ends, not just with justice, but with hope, a powerful reminder that dignity and respect should never be negotiable. Her courage and determination sparked change, proving that even in the face of adversity, resilience shines through. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more stories like this. Together, let's keep spreading messages that matter. Thank you for watching.